I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Nissan Juke. Now, it's a nameplate most of you will probably be familiar with because this was arguably one of the first compact SUVs. Yes, there were vehicles before this, including the likes of the original Toyota RAV4 and the Metro Rancho from the 70s, but this is the car that set the blueprint for today's class with its funky styling and sort of divisive opinions. Now, I think the second generation Juke actually carries off this styling a lot better than the first gen car. It still looks a touch awkward around the front, but I really like the LED lighting signatures on the tops, maybe less so these little jouncy circular ones. And moving to the sides, it's got a lot of horizontal surfaces which sort of give the impression of a wide sports car sort of stance with a narrow cabin on top to sort of reflect the 370Z. And we spent a little bit of time in this STL variant. I know you guys went along and checked this car out with Tom on its Australian launch, but I did a very millennial thing and took it up the coast on a bit of a road trip to go and see the beach. And so we got a little bit more time on some pretty testing roads. Now, the interior of the Juke is pretty much all new for this generation, and from the inside it feels quite sporty. You've got this sort of 370Z/GTR homage in the roofline. Now, I know it's a bit of a stretch to say that, but it is a nice sort of sporty feeling cabin. It's controlled pretty much entirely by this 8-inch touchscreen unit, which is pretty responsive, although it does run a fairly dated looking set of graphics with Nissan's Connect system. That said, it does have wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto as standard now, and on this STL grade and up you get navigation and you also get DAB radio, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, the sound system in this STL is pretty weak, but if you want a better sound system, you have to upgrade to the range-topping TI model, which is quite a lot more expensive for your personal Bose stereo, which is a pretty cool touch, but I don't know if anyone really needs it. Now, moving down, you've got these three sort of ET looking vents here, which are an interesting sort of design piece. And below that, you've got a pretty small climate control panel, which does everything you need. It's only single zone climate control in this STL. You've got to spend a bit more to get dual zone. Then we come to the big issues with the Juke, and that is that there's nowhere really to put your phone. Now, you do have a USB port and a 12-volt socket here, but this tray in front of them isn't actually big enough to fit a contemporary iPhone or Android, so that's a bit annoying. You kind of have to have it in the cup holders, which then means you can't really put any cups in the holders. Interestingly, they do have a little bit of faux carbon fiber design on them, which I'm not a big fan of. It's around the speaker grills as well. I don't know why they needed to do that, but at least there's not heaps of piano black in here. Now, you do have a fairly comfortable armrest on this STL and range-topping TI grades and some covered storage in there. The lower grades, though, do without this armrest and covered storage, which I think is a little bit nickel-dimey. You've also got this sort of loaf-shaped general transmission tunnel with soft-ish padding to keep your knees from getting too sore during hard cornering. In front of the driver, you've got a really nicely sized steering wheel, not too small, not too big. It does have a flat bottom, which is probably a bit much for a car that's, you know, a compact SUV, but it's not too drastic, so it's not an awkward thing to use. You've got your controls on here and flappy pedals behind it, and you've got a set of analog gauges with a 7-inch central digital readout that gives you information about driving and your trip computer and that sort of stuff. It's not particularly powerful, and it's not a fully digital gauge cluster. As for quality in here, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It definitely feels kind of French and a little bit cheap in here. That's really set off as well by the fact that the bonnet popping mechanism is actually on the passenger side, so that gives away to the hints of this car's underpinnings, which are from Renault. But materials on top of the dashboard are soft, though not particularly nice to the touch, and there's a lot of scratchy plastic, and even the door tops are scratchy plastic here in this STL variant. The door cards as well feel a little bit flimsy. That said, the general design of this cockpit is pretty nice, and I've got plenty, in fact bags of room above my head here at 6'2", so you can adopt a nice low driving position, which you can get to pretty easily with these manually adjustable seats, which are sort of, you know, like a tombstoney bucket design, and it's a really comfortable place to spend time. Nissan really know how to do seats. We just wish that for this $36,500 you did get full leather appointed seats. You just get leather accenting on here, but hey, that's fine. They're also heated as well. Now let's jump in the back of the Juke, because although this small SUV is pretty small, you're probably going to have to put 1 or 2 people in the back at some point. So the doors open to a decent width to allow fairly simple ingress. And back here, to be honest, it feels like a little bit of a cocoon, but that's from this car's sort of sloping roofline. Now, if I sit up straight, my head's just brushing the ceiling. I'm 6'2", of course, which means I'm probably too tall for most back seats. And if I can sort of slump down like I'm sitting now, it's actually not too bad, and I've got a little bit of headroom. As for legroom, behind my own driving position, I'm up against the seat, but the seat is at least nice and plush on the back and soft, and toe room is pretty generous. What's not so generous are the amenities back here, because you've got one sole USB charging point, you've got no ventilation, you do have this sort of little cubby below that. The door materials stay the same, really scratchy black plastic material back here. And yeah, it's not a particularly beautiful place to sit. You can see fairly well out over and around these bucket seats, so they're not as bad as some items, but you don't get any armrests, and yeah, it just feels a little bit dark and cramped back here. At least the bench itself is pretty comfortable, on the outboard seats at least, because the middle seat is a real perch in this vehicle, and sitting up, your head really does brush the roof a little bit uncomfortably. However, there are some really easy to access ISOFIX ports with a flip up cover, so you don't lose the cover on both outboard seats. So overall, it's a fine place if you're just using it for a couple / the occasional couple of people in the back, but I wouldn't want to be transporting anyone a huge distance in the back of a Juke. And now we come around to the rear end, which I think is the best angle of this vehicle. You've got this really nice flat surfacing here that sort of accentuates the width of the vehicle, and again gives that sort of small look to the cabin, and these rather attractive LED taillights here. Now, popping that boot, it continues to get better, because the Juke has a really impressive 422 litres of boot space, which is crazy good for this class. The trade-off for that is a pretty significant load lip that you really do have to sort of pick stuff up and over to get into the boot, and the lack of features back here. There are two little shopping bag hooks here, but there's no tie-down points, and the general carpeting feels pretty cheap back here. There is at least a Space Saver spare tyre under the boot floor, so if you get stuck out in the country, you'll have something to fix yourself and get on and going. So let's take this Juke out for a spin on the road. So now we're out on the road in the 2020 Juke STL, and impressions are great. This thing's such a fun little car to drive, and it all centers around this sort of European, very French feeling kind of driving experience. So that's thanks to the CMF-B platform, which this car sits on, that also underpins Renault's Clio, which we don't get here in Australia, and the Captur, which will be arriving soon. And it's a great little chassis. It really makes this car drive very nicely indeed. But we're going to start by talking about the 1 litre 3-cylinder engine under the bonnet, and kicks out maximum outputs of 84 kilowatts and 180 newton meters. And they're pretty adequate outputs. It doesn't feel fast at all, ever, and the engine does its best work above 2000 RPM. The peak torque is at 2400, so it needs a couple of revs on the dial before it goes anywhere. This isn't an issue when you're on a country road, where the DCT 7-speed gearbox shuffles ratios really nice and quickly to keep you in a really good torque band, so you can make pretty decent progress. That said, there's not much point revving it above sort of 4000, 5000 RPM. But the issue comes when you're driving around town streets like we are right now, and the gearbox can be a little bit lackluster in its changing. So when you're in normal mode, it tends to hold onto the gears for a little bit too long, so you're coming up to a roundabout, it'll still be sort of twiddling its thumbs, sitting in 6th gear, waiting for you to accelerate out, and it doesn't kind of kick down quickly enough, so you find yourself in a torque dip, which can be a bit frustrating. Thankfully, the manual paddles behind the steering wheel are a really nice shape and really easy to find all the time, so that becomes less of an issue. Although the fact that there's no actual manual mode in the gearbox is pretty annoying for me, because I really do sometimes like to have control of what's going on in the gearbox. And the other thing with the gearbox is there seems to be a little Frenchman called Jean-Paul activating the clutch, and he's frankly not particularly good at his job. So you do often get these quite sort of lurchy takeoffs and unpleasant maneuvers, and when you're in reverse you have to put a lot of throttle in to get anything out of the gearbox. So it's a bit of a weird feeling gearbox when you're maneuvering around town, and just takes a little bit of getting used to, and can be jerky and a little unpleasant. But as I said, once you're used to it, it's not such a bad thing. And you've got a sporty drive mode, which can be accessed down here by this little button, and that gives you at least slightly better quicker shifts and a little bit more of a throaty throttle note, and it also weights up the steering a little bit. Now, Around town, this Duke is actually pretty good to drive, apart from that slightly intrusive DCT box. You've got a really nice light steering ratio, and it's quick, and you can pull U-turns thanks to its pretty short turning circle anywhere you need to, and the visibility is pretty good. That rear C-pillar back there can be a little bit obtrusive when reversing. However, this STL variant gets a 360 camera and parking sensors front and rear, so it becomes much less of an issue then. The one other thing that some might find a little less pleasant, at least on this STL, is the 19-inch wheels, which can give a little bit of a knobbly ride quality around town on really harsh bumps, so like short concrete expansion joints and that sort of thing. But that said, it's not too bad because they are at least shod in a 45 series sidewall tyre, so there is still a little bit of compliance there. You can get 17s on the entry-level ST and the ST Plus, and that'll just give you a plusher ride. That said, the actual damping of this car is really well judged. It's almost superb. Like, it's so well thought out. It just feels like a really nice amount of stiffness for this car. It gives it that slightly sporty feeling that the outside communicates to the passers-by and to you as you walk up to it, but without being too harsh like a sort of hot hatch. It's got this real sort of old school French ride quality about it that I find really beguiling. It's a really fun thing to drive. And on a backcountry road as well, as you start to get the speed up, the 19-inch alloys seem to be less of an issue again, and it really dances. It sort of pivots just around underneath your knees, and yeah, it's a really fun little thing to drive. You do have to work that gearbox pretty hard and keep the engine on the boil at all times to get the best out of this Duke. But that said, you do get pretty respectable fuel economy in this thing. With our run that we did up the mid-north coast of New South Wales, we returned just over 6 litres per 100, which is pretty impressive given that we took in some pretty twisty technical back roads on the way up. We obviously went the long way. And after coming back into town, it's settled down to around 7.4 litres per 100. And around town, with my fairly heavy right foot, I tend to get 9.5-ish litres per 100, which I think is fairly respectable. There is an auto start-stop system, but it does sort of take a little while to engage first gear, so it's annoying, and I usually just leave that turned off. Now, as for safety gear, you'll be glad to know that the Duke actually comes pretty well equipped in all grades. So from the ST Plus up, you get adaptive cruise control, and from the base ST, you get pretty much every other safety feature you could need. So that means rear cross traffic alert, high-speed AEB with pedestrian detection, and lane departure warning. Now, also on this STL variant, you get lane keep assist, which works via the brakes, which in other Nissans seems to be pretty ineffective, but in this car at least, they do clamp down a little bit harder, but it's still not as good as a full steering wheel functioning system. So for me, I just, again, pretty much leave it turned off, although that adaptive cruise control is a nice thing to have. So all in all then, the Duke has a bags full of character, and it just feels like a pretty old school French hatchback, which I think is a pretty big compliment coming from someone like me. So what do we think of the Nissan Duke STL? Well, it's definitely not a cheap vehicle, but it is a really fun, involving car to drive on backcountry roads, and it's an easy thing to pilot around the city. That engine too is a pretty sweet unit if it isn't the most powerful. Now, it's not the most expensive vehicle in this class, but you can definitely drive your dollar harder by going for something more traditional like a hatchback. That said, there's few hatchbacks that look as wild as this do, so if that's what you're about, then the Duke might just be the vehicle for you. Now, you can let me know what you think of the Duke styling in the comments section down below, and while you're down there, we'd also love it if you could hit subscribe and that bell icon. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.